generals and advisors in the State Department told him that this was not a smart move. Well, I want to address both of these claims. First off, the claim about anti-Semitism. To do this, I want to turn to the historian Robert Dallek, who's written on Nixon and Kissinger. According to Dallek, Nixon was, quote, a cultural anti-Semite who saw Jews as a central part of the liberal Northeastern establishment, which had dismissed him as unworthy of high political office. Nixon believed that American Jews were more loyal to Israel than to their own country, and sometimes described them as Jewish traitors. When the media ran stories that he considered unfriendly, as it often did, the Jews were his go-to targets to vent his frustration. So, for example, when the details of the Mile High Massacre became public, Nixon ranted to his aides that, quote, it was those dirty, rotten Jews from New York who were behind it. Nixon often chided Kissinger for being Jewish in order to put him in his place. So once, fed up with Kissinger's habitual lateness to meetings, Nixon complained to his chief of staff that Kissinger was acting, quote, Jewish and also juvenile. He really is Jewish as hell, isn't it? But here's the real question. Was Nixon somehow pro-Israel despite being anti-Semitic? I think the answer to this question can also be found in a passage described by Robert Dallek. He says, quote, Shelley Buchanan, Pat's wife, asked the president what the prospects for Israel were. The long run, Nixon responded. He extended his right fist, thumbs up, in the manner of a Roman emperor passing sentence on a gladiator, and then slowly turned his thumb over and down. Nixon was an anti-Semite who had no sympathy for the state of Israel. Why, then, did he, quote-unquote, save it? I'm going to argue that the American response to this crisis was not affected by any personal pro-Israel bias on the part of either Nixon or Kissinger. Rather, they responded by carefully calculating how best to preserve the status quo. First and foremost, the administration wanted to preserve the territorial status quo antebellum between Israel and its neighbors so that all sides would have something to gain by sitting down to negotiate after the war. Second, it wanted to preserve Washington's role as the prime mediator in the Middle East while keeping the Soviets out to make sure that they usurp them in this role to gain a foothold in the Middle East. Finally, Nixon and Kissinger wanted to preserve Nixon's presidency in the midst of the Watergate scandal by propagating the myth that Nixon had saved Israel, thereby appealing to a largely pro-Israel American public. So this idea that Nixon is the savior of Israel, just out of the goodness of his heart, is really just, I would argue, a myth that was concocted and proliferated by Nixon and Kissinger themselves. Now, first and foremost, it's essential to keep in mind that if anyone indeed saved Israel, if any American saved Israel, it was Kissinger, not Nixon. On the first day of the war, believing Nixon to be too politically and psychologically damaged by the Watergate scandal to make decisions involved in a crisis situation such as this one, Kissinger unilaterally decided to centralize control of the crisis in his own hands. Meanwhile, Kissinger is actually in Florida, not even in Washington. He's in Florida